Well, as I mentioned at the outset, this is the second week of our message series, a series that we are calling Me, Myself, and Us. And last week we began by recognizing that lately we have had in our lives a whole lot more of me and myself than we have of us. We talked about how the social distancing and separation we have faced during this pandemic has truly challenged us in many ways. And we contrasted our current experience of isolation with the story we heard from the Acts of the Apostles, where, rather than just praying from a distance for the well-being of new Christians, the church in Jerusalem, it's where the church began, of course, the church in Jerusalem sent Peter and John to be with the new Christians in Samaria, to deepen their relationship by sharing the Holy Spirit, by sharing God through prayer and the laying on of hands. And we also recognized how in that same story we can see God depending on Peter and John in order to deepen his relationship with those new Christians. He didn't have to. He is God, after all. He is all-powerful. He didn't have to, but he chose to. And we realized also that he continues to make that choice, that same choice, not just within the church, but he also continues to depend on us, each of us, in our relationships with each other, to deepen his relationship with us, whoever we might be and whatever we might think about him. That's how he works. In other words, God shares his gifts with us not just in the obvious ways, like prayer and sacraments, though most certainly he does, but also in and through our relationships with one another. And that is what is happening, as I said, whether or not we know God or believe in him. He made us all, and he works in and through us. We also thought about what that might mean for us. That if this is true, our everyday life, with its conversations and arguments, joy and laughter, even its sorrow and tears, our ordinary life is actually something much bigger and more important than we might at first realize. That your life and mine is something in which God is directly involved. Something on which, in a certain way, he is depending on me and you. So, God is depending on us, but are we ready for that? Are we up to the task? It's a question that I must admit sometimes I even ask myself. Now, you probably will not be surprised to hear that I believe in God. I believe also that he wants to work through me in my relationships with others, and also to work in me from the other side of those same relationships. I believe that. But still, it can be a bit intimidating. And there are days when I contemplate the ordinariness of my life and the profound importance that it bears, and I just feel like saying, no, Lord, I'm not ready. It's too much pressure. Can't I just wait until I've got my act together? Now, that might make it seem like I have, at least from time to time, that I have what we would call in everyday life commitment issues. And that might be true. But I'm guessing that I'm not alone. Actually, I suspect we all have commitment issues one way or another. Even the apostles in today's story from the Gospel of Matthew seem to have had commitment issues. That Gospel tells us the story of what we in the church call the Ascension, and I talked about that before Mass. Now, within the story of the Ascension, as I intimated, there are some profound theological issues, but I'm not going to talk about those. Instead, I want to dive into the apostles and their commitment issues. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped, but some doubted. You might wonder why there are 11 disciples, not 12. Our story takes place after Judas' betrayal, after the Lord's death and resurrection, but before the disciples, the apostles, chose his replacement. So we hear the 11 disciples, the apostles, came together to encounter the risen Jesus at this profound moment. The gospel tells us they come together and they worship him, but some doubt. Commitment issues. And that becomes even clearer when we consider the word doubted, because in the original Greek text, that same word also means hesitate. So we could read today's gospel as they worshiped him, but some hesitated. Now there is a classic case of a commitment issue. And now, for your entertainment, here is another one. commitment issues. It might seem surprising that Matthew even included that part of the story in his gospel, but it shouldn't be. Anyone who thinks that the Gospels are nothing but propaganda, nothing but a public relations effort for Christianity and for Christians, hasn't really read them. They constantly, throughout the course of the story, in all four of the Gospels, show us the disciples, the apostles for that matter, messing up. They regularly, not always, but regularly come across as proud, sometimes ambitious, unfaithful, and as we hear today, even at this great moment, hesitant. Like you and me, they had commitment issues. Now that should really give us comfort, because it shows us that like any other meaningful relationship, a relationship with Jesus isn't a job for which only the perfect need apply. Rather, the word relationship itself describes a process of relationship, a process of learning and growing. And despite their imperfections, the apostles grew. They grew in their relationship with Jesus. And growth is part of God's dream for your life as well. Growth in relationship with Him and with others. So how do we do it? How do we deepen our relationships? Well, there are many possible answers to that question, but I want to start with one that we find in today's second reading. That reading is an excerpt from a letter written by St. Paul to one of the early local churches, a Christian community in a particular place, very much like us. It's a letter he wrote advising them on the Christian life, and of course, as he does that, he's advising them on growing in their relationship with God. I pray, Paul writes, I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give you a spirit of wisdom and revelation as you come to know Him, so that you may know what is the hope to which He has called you. Of course, our quote is first a prayer that God will pour out His gifts of wisdom and revelation. But that prayer also tells us that those gifts are not just given at random. It's not some sort of divine slot machine that when you pull at a particular moment happens to give gifts. Rather, they are given, as we heard, as we come to know Him. And it's the same in every relationship. Each of us has gifts to give to others, but those gifts are not always easy to see. Consider your own life. I'm willing to bet there is at least one important relationship in your life, maybe more, where you just didn't click with the other person at first. In fact, maybe they were at first more annoying to you than engaging or attractive. Now, just because your relationship eventually clicked doesn't necessarily mean that you were wrong. In fact, it's quite possible that that person is still annoying from time to time. It's just that now you know them better. Over time, just like the Lord, they have poured their gifts into your life and you've come to recognize them. And if you ask them, I'll bet you would hear that you also have poured your gifts into their life. As I have said, the Lord depends on this exchange of gifts to help Him deepen His relationship with both of you. Remember last week I asked you to recall moments when you had been given gifts in relationships with others. He depends on that exchange. He doesn't have to depend, but He chooses to depend. John, the beloved disciple, puts it like this in one of his letters to one of the early Christian churches. If anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And He has given us this command: whoever loves God must also love his brother. So let's recap. It's been quite a journey already. We are made for relationship. In fact, to live a full, abundant, and joyful life, the life for which we were created, we need relationship with God, but also with each other. And it turns out God Himself has a stake in us and in our relationships. We have very likely indeed experienced the blessings of relationship in our life. But we also know and have experienced that meaningful, life-giving relationships take time. It takes time to get to know someone, to appreciate their gifts, to grow in relationship. And time, so often today, seems to be a commodity in short supply. Time, in fact, or more precisely not having enough time, is one of the basic reasons for our commitment issues. Now, at the moment, it may seem very well like some of us have nothing but time, and that indeed is likely true for some. But it does also seem unlikely that our busyness will never, ever return. And then, once again, we will push up against the reality that commitment and relationship come at a cost. And one of the costs is time. My time, a precious commodity. So, again, in ordinary times, I'm going to think twice about giving it away. I'm going to hesitate. And that is not irrational. In ordinary times, and for some of us still even now, we struggle to find the time for all the good things that we would like to do and for the relationships that we would like to have and in which to grow. One of the solutions that has emerged in everyday life is something that used to be called, back in the olden times, which I remember very well, the times of pen and paper. One of the solutions that has emerged is something that we used to call a day planner. And now, for many of us as individuals, as organizations, even as families, it might take the form of some sort of electronically shared calendar or planner. I can tell you, even from my experience, that most Catholic parishes today of any size pretty much depend on a shared calendar to get things done and to continue to move forward. Maybe you do the same thing, as I said, in your own family. Practically speaking, it seems a necessity. It helps us to structure our time and our lives. But now, I want to take you in a different direction. Because in truth, we have already been given something to help us structure our time and our lives. Something that we call, I don't know whether you've heard of this or not, something that we call night and day. Remember that story of creation that we talked about last week. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. Now, last week, from that point, we just skipped ahead a bit, but today, let's just continue reading from there. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. We have already been given a way of structuring our day, the boundary between night and day. And it is boundaries that we need to help us make time for relationships, to help us grow, to live the more abundant, joyful life that is God's dream for each of us. It is boundaries we need, but it is also boundaries, practically speaking, that we do not have, at least not always where we need them. Our world, our economic world in particular, but sometimes you and I in our own life as well, our world is not a great respecter of boundaries. Even the simple natural boundary of night and day. It almost comes to feel extraneous in our life of 24-hour-day electricity and access to the world. Of course, in this part of the world, that natural boundary shifts a little bit depending on the season, but even so, how many of us, for some part of the year at least, begin our day in darkness, our working day? And how often does work or other responsibilities also spill over into darkness at the other end of the day? Indeed, some of us even end up working a great part of our life at night. Now, from a Christian point of view, work is a good thing. The witness of Scripture confirms it. Listen to this nugget from the book of Proverbs. And in fact, the book of Proverbs is pretty much a collection of these kind of nuggets. Laziness brings on deep sleep. An idle person will suffer hunger. And St. Paul himself, in the era of the church, the New Testament, writing to one of those early Christian communities, says this: "For when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat." So work is not a bad thing. Entered into from the proper perspective and put in its proper place in our life, it is the opposite. It is a good thing. But what is the proper place of work in our life? Protestant pastor Randy Frazee, in his book Making Room for Life, suggests that without us making some intentional choices, it can be almost impossible to put work in its proper place and to truly find the balance between work and the rest of our life that we need. simple physical needs like sleep, and higher, more complex needs like relationship. Now, our need for sleep is obvious. It's simple, straightforward biology. We are made, or if you prefer, have evolved, so that when the sun comes up, we are stimulated to work, to activity of some kind. And when the sun goes down, our bodies expect a transition out of the pressures of the day and into preparing for an evening of replenishing rest. How we use this time, this transitional time, is vital. Keep active and busy, overstimulated and stressed out until the end of the day, and we all likely know from experience we will not be well prepared for sleep. We will not likely sleep well, and we will be worse off the next day, both for work and relationship, but also quite possibly for sleep. It can be a vicious circle. So our days need structure. They need boundaries. Boundaries more fundamental than the number of things that can fit on one particular day in our calendar. And as I have suggested, the boundary that we need is the very one we find in the story of creation, the boundary between night and day. And that boundary is woven into the fabric of the world. And so are we. Whether you think our world was created by God or is the product of evolution, and for Catholics both can be true, either way, today's environmental movement regularly and constantly in a salutary way reminds us that we trample and destroy the fabric of nature at our own risk. Might not the same thing apply to our own human nature, which is also part of our world? So, Father, if you are so bright, what is the solution? Well, first, our life, our human nature, is not a scientific problem to be solved. Rather, it is a mystery, a theological mystery, not a murder mystery where we could just come to the end and say, oh, the butler did it. Not that kind of a mystery. A theological mystery, the mystery of our lives and ourselves, is a reality that, however deeply we engage it and encounter it, always seems to have more that it can reveal to us. God is like that, and we are like that. So we cannot say there is only one solution. But as Randy Frazee suggests, it is always better for us to live our life with a little bit of reflection and to make intentional choices, rather than simply let our life and our world make our choices for us. So, for your homework this week, I want you to ask yourself some questions. Do it in your quiet time. Take a moment in that time, of course, to recognize that you are in the presence of the one who made you and who loves you, that you are in the presence of God. That same God desires to bless you in many ways, but also in and through your relationships. And as you settle into that quiet time and achieve at least a moment of peace, ask yourselves a few questions. Here they are. Looking back on ordinary times, how much of your typical day and week is given to work? How much to sleep? How much to relationship? Important relationships. Do you think that you are getting that balance right? Reflect. Now, presuming that you would like to change, and I suspect most of us would, what are some of the barriers that you can see? Maybe they've been coming up to you as I've been talking about this. What are some of the barriers you can see that might make that difficult? Next week, we're going to begin to look at ways we might be able to make a change, be able to get around some of those barriers, because they're not imaginary, they are very practical and real. We are going to look at some habits and practices we might be able to change that would allow us to regain some balance between work and the rest of life, to make time for relationships. And we're going to consider next week also another boundary that can help us. A boundary that we Christians believe is also written into the fabric of creation. I wonder if you can guess what it is.